For 2 years, the war in North Africa had been a dizzying, back-and-forth race across the desert. But in the late summer of 1942, the retreat ended. The British Empire stood with its back to the Nile. Today, we witness a battle of wills, logistics, and intelligence. The final showdown between the cunning of Rommel's Desert Fox and the methodical power of Montgomery's rebuilt Eighth Army. The prize, the Suez Canal. The cost, everything. This is the battle that changed the fortunes of the war. This is the Second Battle of El Alamein. In the autumn of 1942, along a desolate stretch of Egyptian desert west of Alexandria, two exhausted armies faced each other across minefields, barbed wire, and sand. To the east stood the British Eighth Army, defending the last line before the Suez Canal and the strategic riches of the Middle East. To the west stood the Afrika Korps and its Italian allies, having advanced farther than any Axis force would reach in North Africa. Between them lay a narrow battlefield, a bottleneck between the Mediterranean Sea and an impassable depression in the desert, where one of the most decisive battles of the Second World War would be fought. This was El Alamein, and the battle fought here in late October 1942 would mark the beginning of the end of Axis power in North Africa. This is the story of the Second Battle of El Alamein, a battle of deception, attrition, and ultimately, decisive victory that would change the course of the war. To understand El Alamein, one must first understand the seesaw war that had raged across North Africa for 2 years. Since 1940, British and Axis forces had advanced and retreated across the Libyan desert in a pattern that seemed endless. The British would advance, overextending their supply lines. The Axis would counterattack, pushing the British back. Then the Axis would overextend, and the British would counterattack in turn. By the summer of 1942, the pendulum had swung decisively in favor of the Axis. Under the brilliant leadership of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, German and Italian forces had driven the British back hundreds of miles, capturing the vital port of Tobruk in June and pushing all the way to the El Alamein defensive line, just 60 miles from Alexandria and 150 miles from the Suez Canal. The strategic stakes could not have been higher. If Rommel broke through at El Alamein, Alexandria would fall. The Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and the Far East, would be threatened. The entire Middle East, with its vital oil reserves, might fall under Axis control. And there was an even more terrifying possibility. If Axis forces secured the Middle East, they might link up with Japanese forces advancing through Asia, creating a continuous Axis-controlled territory stretching from France to the Pacific. The British had to hold at El Alamein. There was nowhere left to retreat. But El Alamein had one crucial advantage for the defender: geography. The battlefield was a narrow corridor, approximately 40 miles wide, bounded on the north by the Mediterranean Sea and on the south by the Qattara Depression, a vast, impassable salt marsh lying below sea level, impossible for vehicles or even infantry to cross in any numbers. This meant that Rommel, whose greatest strength was maneuver, sweeping around the enemy's southern flank, cutting supply lines, forcing retreats, could not use his favorite tactic. At El Alamein, there was no southern flank to turn. The battlefield was a bottleneck, and the only way through was a frontal assault against prepared defenses. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was 50 years old in 1942, a career officer who had earned his reputation as a master of mobile warfare during the campaigns in France and North Africa. He was bold, aggressive, willing to take risks that more cautious commanders avoided. His soldiers, German and Italian alike, trusted him implicitly. His enemies respected him, sometimes reluctantly. Even Churchill spoke admiringly of Rommel's tactical brilliance. But by October 1942, Rommel faced problems that tactical brilliance alone could not solve. The Afrika Korps was chronically short of supplies, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, even food. British naval and air forces, operating from Malta, were intercepting and sinking Axis supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean. What supplies did arrive had to be transported hundreds of miles across the desert from ports in Libya. Moreover, Rommel himself was ill. Months of desert campaigning had taken their toll. He suffered from jaundice, low blood pressure, digestive problems, and exhaustion. In September, his doctors had ordered him to return to Germany for rest and treatment. Rommel had reluctantly complied, leaving temporary command to General George Stumme while he recovered. Rommel would be in Germany, hundreds of miles from the battlefield, when the British offensive began. And the new British commander facing him was a man of very different temperament, a man who would prove to be Rommel's match and perhaps his superior. In August 1942, following a series of command changes and disagreements, Prime Minister Winston Churchill had appointed a new commander for the Eighth Army, Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery, soon to be known universally as Monty. Montgomery was 54 years old, a career infantry officer with a reputation for meticulous planning, attention to detail, and absolute confidence in his own abilities. He was abrasive, arrogant, difficult to work with, and utterly convinced that he would never lose a battle. His subordinates either loved him or hated him, but they respected his competence. Montgomery's arrival transformed the Eighth Army. He immediately toured the front lines, visiting units, talking to soldiers, radiating confidence that the days of retreat were over. He announced that there would be no more withdrawals. The Eighth Army would stand at El Alamein and, when ready, would attack and destroy the Axis forces. No more seesaw. No more retreat. Victory. The soldiers, exhausted from months of defeat and withdrawal, responded to Montgomery's confidence. Morale, which had been dangerously low, began to improve. Training intensified. New equipment arrived, including American M4 Sherman tanks, superior to anything the Axis possessed. And Montgomery began planning his offensive with meticulous care. The contrast between the two commanders could not have been greater. Rommel, intuitive, aggressive, a master of improvisation, but starved of supplies and weakened by illness. Montgomery, methodical, cautious, unwilling to attack until everything was perfectly prepared, but backed by improving supply lines and growing material superiority. The stage was set for the decisive battle. Montgomery was planning his offensive for late October. Rommel was in Germany, recovering his health. And between their two armies lay the most heavily fortified battlefield in North Africa, a maze of mines, barbed wire, and defensive positions that the Germans called the Devil's Gardens. The question was not whether the British would attack. Montgomery had made that clear. The question was whether they could break through. Montgomery's plan for the offensive, codenamed Operation Lightfoot, was based on a simple but brutal concept: attrition. Rather than attempting a dramatic breakthrough or clever flanking maneuver, Montgomery would use his superior numbers and firepower to systematically grind down the Axis defenses until they collapsed. The plan called for the main attack in the north, near the coast, where the terrain was firmer and where a breakthrough would threaten the vital coast road, the Axis army's main supply route. Infantry would advance at night, clearing paths through the extensive minefields, allowing armor to push through and engage Axis forces beyond. It would be slow, costly, and methodical, but Montgomery was confident it would work. But Montgomery understood that success depended on surprise, or at least on keeping the Axis uncertain about where and when the main blow would fall. And so, alongside the operational planning, British intelligence and engineers executed one of the most elaborate deception operations of the war, Operation Bertram. The goal of Bertram was to convince Rommel that the main British attack would come in the south, not the north, and that it would not begin until November, not October. To achieve this, the British engaged in an elaborate campaign of misdirection, camouflage, and false construction. In the southern sector, the British constructed dummy tanks, wooden and canvas frameworks painted to look like real armor from the air. These tanks were positioned where Axis reconnaissance aircraft could see them, suggesting a massive armor concentration in the south. Meanwhile, real tanks in the north were disguised as trucks using specially designed covers called sunshields. A fake water pipeline was constructed in the south, a project that would obviously take weeks to complete, suggesting that any British offensive would not begin until the pipeline was finished in November. In reality, The British had adequate water supplies stored in forward positions in the north. Dummy supply dumps were built in the south, complete with fake fuel tanks and ammunition stores. False radio traffic suggested unit movements that were not actually occurring. Even hospital facilities in the rear were positioned to suggest the main effort would be in the south. The deception was comprehensive, elaborate, and successful. Axis intelligence concluded that the main British attack, when it came, would be in the south, and probably not until early November. The actual offensive, striking in the north in late October, would achieve a degree of surprise that Montgomery needed. But beyond deception, Montgomery had built a genuine material superiority. By late October, the 8th Army numbered approximately 195,000 men to the Axis 104,000. The British had 1,029 tanks, including 252 of the new Sherman tanks, against approximately 500 Axis tanks, many of them older Italian models. British artillery numbered 908 guns against 500 Axis guns. And critically, the British had air superiority. The Royal Air Force could attack Axis positions, supply lines, and airfields almost at will. The British advantages in numbers, equipment, and supply were overwhelming. The question was whether these advantages could overcome the Axis defensive preparations and the tactical skill of their commanders. On the afternoon of October 23, 1942, British soldiers of the 8th Army waited in their assembly positions. Infantry battalions, Scottish, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian troops representing the Empire, prepared to advance through the minefields. Tank crews checked their Shermans, Crusaders, and Grants. Artillery crews stood by their guns, ready to begin the bombardment. And Montgomery, at his headquarters, reviewed the plan one final time. At 9:40 p.m., as darkness fell over the desert, the bombardment began. Over 900 British guns opened fire simultaneously along the northern sector. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard dozens of miles away. High explosive shells crashed down on Axis positions, destroying bunkers, cutting communications lines, and suppressing defensive fire. The bombardment continued for 20 minutes, targeting Axis artillery positions and command posts. Then, at 10 p.m., the guns shifted their fire to the forward defensive positions, the minefields and trench lines where Axis infantry waited. And under this curtain of fire, British infantry began their advance. The attack was preceded by mine-clearing teams, sappers crawling forward with detectors, probing the ground for mines, marking safe paths with tape for the infantry following behind. It was dangerous, painstaking work. Mines were everywhere. The Germans had laid over 500,000 mines in the defensive zone, creating belts several miles deep. The Italians had added more. The entire battlefield was a maze of explosives. The sappers worked methodically, despite incoming fire, despite casualties. Behind them came the infantry, advancing through the cleared lanes, attacking Axis defensive positions, clearing bunkers and trenches. The fighting was close quarters, brutal. Grenades, bayonets, small arms fire in the darkness. By dawn on October 24th, the infantry had achieved significant penetration, in some places advancing several miles through the defensive zone. But the armor, which was supposed to pass through the cleared lanes and break into open ground beyond, was stalled. The lanes through the minefields were too narrow, creating bottlenecks. Axis anti-tank guns, hidden in prepared positions, picked off tanks as they emerged from the lanes. And in several places, uncleared mines disabled vehicles, blocking the paths for those following. Montgomery's plan had called for the armor to break through on the first night and engage Axis forces in a mobile battle beyond the defensive zone. Instead, by the morning of October 24th, the armor was still fighting for position within the minefields, suffering heavy casualties, making slower progress than expected. For the Axis defenders, the British offensive was a crisis but not yet a catastrophe. The defensive positions had held in most places. The armor had not broken through. And General Stummy, the temporary commander in Rommel's absence, believed the line could be stabilized with local counterattacks. But on the morning of October 24th, as Stumy was driving forward to assess the situation personally, his vehicle came under fire. His driver, attempting to evade, swerved violently. Stumy, who had a weak heart, suffered a fatal heart attack and fell from the vehicle. His body would not be found for hours. With Stumy dead and the offensive intensifying, the German High Command urgently recalled Rommel from Germany. On the evening of October 24th, Rommel boarded an aircraft and flew through the night, arriving in North Africa on the afternoon of October 25th. He immediately drove to the front to take command and assess the situation. What he found was grim. The British had penetrated the defensive zone in multiple places. Casualties were mounting. Fuel and ammunition were running critically low. Some panzer divisions had fuel for perhaps 2 or 3 days of intensive operations, no more. Italian units, less well-equipped and less motivated than their German counterparts, were beginning to waver. For the next week, the battle settled into a grinding, attritional struggle. The British attacked repeatedly, probing for weak points, wearing down Axis strength. Montgomery's tactic, which he called crumbling, involved launching multiple attacks at different points along the line, forcing Rommel to commit his reserves to contain each attack, gradually exhausting Axis combat power. Australian troops fought a particularly brutal series of engagements in the northern sector, capturing key positions near the coast road. New Zealand and British units attacked in the centre. South African and Indian troops held defensive positions, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The casualties on both sides mounted steadily. British tank losses were heavy, Shermans and Crusaders knocked out by German 88mm anti-tank guns, the most feared anti-tank weapon in the desert. Infantry units suffered significant casualties in the grinding close-quarters fighting. But British replacements and supplies continued to arrive. Montgomery could sustain his losses. Rommel could not. By early November, the Axis position was becoming untenable. Fuel was almost exhausted. Ammunition was running low. The Italian divisions were disintegrating, entire units surrendering or simply abandoning their positions. And Rommel's panzer divisions, the elite corps of the Afrika Korps, had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Montgomery, recognizing that the Axis line was weakening, prepared his final blow. On November 2nd, he launched Operation Supercharge, a massive, concentrated assault aimed at breaking through the weakened Axis defenses and forcing a general retreat. The decisive phase of the battle was about to begin. Operation Supercharge began in the early hours of November 2nd, 1942, with another massive artillery bombardment, over 300 guns concentrating their fire on a narrow front. The objective was to punch through the Axis line south of the earlier Australian advances, creating a breach through which British armour could pour. The assault was led by the New Zealand Division, supported by British armoured brigades equipped with Sherman tanks. The infantry advanced under the artillery barrage, overrunning Axis positions, clearing paths for the armour. By dawn, the attack had achieved a significant penetration, several miles deep in places, threatening to rupture the Axis defensive line completely. Rommel, recognizing the mortal danger, committed his remaining panzer reserves to counterattack and seal the breach. Throughout November 2nd and 3rd, desperate armored battles raged across the desert. German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs against British Shermans and Grants, at ranges of a few hundred yards, in swirling dust clouds that made visibility and target identification nearly impossible. The fighting was chaotic, brutal, and decisive. The German panzers, despite their crew's skill and experience, were outnumbered and outgunned. The Sherman, with its 75mm gun, could penetrate German armor at ranges where German guns were less effective. More critically, when Shermans were knocked out, replacement tanks were available. When German panzers were destroyed, there were no replacements. By the evening of November 3rd, Rommel faced the inevitable reality: the Afrika Korps was defeated. His remaining armor was reduced to fewer than 40 operational tanks. Fuel reserves were almost exhausted, Some units had fuel for perhaps 20 miles of movement. Italian divisions were surrendering en masse or simply dissolving. The line could not be held. Rommel made the only militarily sensible decision. He ordered a general retreat. The Afrika Korps would withdraw westward, back toward Libya, abandoning equipment that could not be moved for lack of fuel, trying to save as much of the army as possible for future operations. But then, on November 3rd, Rommel received a message from Adolf Hitler that would transform an orderly retreat into a catastrophe. The message, transmitted from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, ordered Rommel not to retreat. The Afrika Korps would hold its positions. Every man would fight to the death if necessary. There would be no withdrawal. It was an order born of ideology, not military reality. Hitler, sitting thousands of miles from the battlefield, refused to accept that retreat was necessary. The order was militarily insane. It would result in the destruction of forces that could have been saved for future operations. Rommel, faced with this impossible order, hesitated. He had already issued orders for the retreat. Units were beginning to withdraw. But countermanding Hitler's direct order was almost unthinkable. It could result in his dismissal, his disgrace, perhaps even his execution. For crucial hours, Rommel vacillated, trying to balance military necessity against political reality. Meanwhile, British forces continued their attacks, widening the breach, threatening to encircle Axis units that should have been withdrawing. Finally, on November 4th, with the situation collapsing around him, Rommel made his decision. He would disobey Hitler's order. The retreat would continue. Some units, those that had remained in position following Hitler's order, were now in danger of being cut off. But most of the Afrika Korps could still escape if they moved immediately. The Second Battle of El Alamein was over. The retreat, which would stretch across Libya and into Tunisia over the following months, had begun. Montgomery, recognizing that the Axis line had broken, ordered his forces to pursue. British armor pushed through the breach, fanning out to cut off retreating Axis units. The Royal Air Force attacked the crowded coast road, strafing and bombing the retreating columns. It was, Montgomery hoped, the beginning of a pursuit that would destroy the Afrika Korps entirely. But the pursuit did not achieve the dramatic results Montgomery expected. Rommel, despite the chaos of the retreat, managed to maintain some degree of order. German rearguards fought skillful delaying actions, buying time for the main force to escape. And critically, British forces, after 10 days of continuous fighting, were exhausted, their vehicles worn out, their supplies stretched thin. The rain, when it came on November 6th, turned the desert into mud, slowing the British advance and giving Rommel additional time to organize his retreat. By the time the weather cleared, the Afrika Korps had escaped the immediate threat of encirclement, though it continued retreating westward, abandoning Libya, eventually reaching Tunisia where it would make its final stand. The Second Battle of El Alamein was over. The victory was decisive, but not quite complete. Rommel had escaped with part of his force intact. But the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Never again would Axis forces threaten Egypt or the Suez Canal. Never again would Rommel launch the kind of sweeping offensive that had characterized his earlier campaigns. The human cost of the battle was staggering. British and Commonwealth forces suffered approximately 13,560 casualties, 2,350 killed, 8,950 wounded, and 2,260 missing. These losses were heavy, but they were sustainable. Reinforcements and replacements were available. Axis casualties were catastrophic. Approximately 30,000 killed, wounded, or missing, including 10,000 Germans and 20,000 Italians. Another 30,000 to 40,000 were captured, many of them Italians who surrendered en masse as their units disintegrated. The Afrika Korps lost over 450 tanks destroyed or abandoned, virtually its entire armored strength. Hundreds of artillery pieces, thousands of vehicles, and enormous quantities of supplies fell into British hands. But beyond the casualty statistics, El Alamein marked a fundamental shift in the North African campaign and in the broader war. For 2 years, Axis forces had advanced and retreated across the desert, never decisively defeated, always capable of counterattacking. El Alamein ended that pattern. The Axis had been decisively beaten. They would never again mount a major offensive in North Africa. Moreover, El Alamein came at a crucial psychological moment for the Allies. In the autumn of 1942, Allied fortunes elsewhere remained mixed at best. The Germans were deep into the Soviet Union, fighting at Stalingrad. The Japanese held vast territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Allied victory remained distant and uncertain. El Alamein was the first clear, decisive British victory over German forces in the entire war. Yes, the Battle of Britain had been a defensive victory in 1940. Yes, British forces had won smaller engagements elsewhere. But El Alamein was different, a major offensive operation, deliberately planned and executed, that had defeated a German army commanded by one of their finest generals. The psychological impact on British morale was enormous. After years of defeats and retreats, after Dunkirk and Singapore and Tobruk, Britain had finally won a clear victory. Church bells, silent since 1940, rang out across Britain in celebration. Montgomery became a national hero overnight. Winston Churchill, speaking later about the war's course, would famously say, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." It was a slight exaggeration, there would be setbacks and defeats ahead. But the essential truth of the statement was sound. El Alamein marked the point where the initiative in the West shifted decisively to the Allies. And El Alamein did not stand alone. Just days after the battle ended, on November 8, 1942, American and British forces launched Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, landing in Morocco and Algeria. Axis forces in North Africa now faced British forces advancing from the east and American forces pressing from the west. The remaining Axis forces, the remnants of the Afrika Korps and the Italian divisions, along with reinforcements hastily sent from Europe, would hold out in Tunisia through the winter and into the spring of 1943. They would fight skillfully and at times inflict sharp defeats on inexperienced American troops. But the strategic outcome was never in doubt. Trapped between two Allied forces, with their supply lines under constant attack, running short of fuel and ammunition, the Axis forces in Tunisia could only delay the inevitable. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops went into captivity, losses comparable to the German disaster at Stalingrad. North Africa was secure. The Mediterranean was opening to Allied shipping. And the stage was set for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. But all of this, the final victory in Tunisia, the invasions of Sicily and Italy, the eventual Allied advance into northern Europe, flowed from El Alamein. It was at El Alamein that the pattern of Axis advance was finally, definitively broken. It was there that Montgomery demonstrated that meticulous planning, material superiority, and methodical execution could defeat even the most brilliant tactical commanders. And it was at El Alamein that the myth of Axis invincibility, carefully cultivated through 2 years of victories, was shattered. The Germans could be beaten. Their armies could be destroyed. Victory, though still distant, was possible. The Second Battle of El Alamein deserves its place among the decisive battles of the Second World War not because it was the largest or the bloodiest. Far larger battles would be fought on the Eastern Front, but because of its strategic and psychological impact. It marked the turning of the tide in the West. And it proved that the Allies, when properly led and adequately supplied, could meet and defeat the best the Axis could field. In the weeks following the Battle of El Alamein, as the Afrika Korps retreated westward across Libya and British forces pursued, the true significance of the victory became clear, not just to military planners but to the populations of the warring nations and to neutral observers watching the war's progress. For Germany, El Alamein was a shock. The German public had been fed a steady diet of victory announcements for 3 years. Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, all had fallen. The advance into the Soviet Union, though stalled at Moscow and now bogged down at Stalingrad, still seemed impressive. German propaganda had portrayed Rommel as a near-mythical figure, the desert fox whose tactical brilliance was unmatched. Now, suddenly, Rommel had been defeated. The Afrika Korps was in retreat. German and Italian prisoners were being marched into captivity by the thousands. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht was tarnished, perhaps irreparably. German propaganda tried to minimize the defeat, speaking of tactical withdrawals and blaming Italian units for collapsing. But the truth could not be hidden indefinitely. Rommel himself, in communications with Berlin, made clear that the defeat had been total and that the Axis position in North Africa was untenable. For Britain and the Commonwealth nations, El Alamein was vindication. The British Empire, which had stood alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France in 1940, had finally demonstrated that it could fight and win major land battles against German forces. The victory was particularly significant for the Commonwealth troops who had borne much of the fighting: Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian units that had fought with distinction at El Alamein. These forces, representing nations across the globe, had proved their worth in one of the war's decisive battles. The British Empire, for all its flaws and the tensions that would eventually lead to its dissolution, had shown it could still fight effectively as a unified force. For Montgomery, El Alamein established him as one of Britain's, and the Allies', most successful commanders. His meticulous planning, his ability to build and maintain troop morale, and his willingness to fight a methodical battle of attrition rather than seeking dramatic breakthroughs had all been vindicated. Montgomery would go on to command British forces in Sicily, Italy, and northwestern Europe, eventually accepting the German surrender at the end of the war. But El Alamein remained his signature victory, the battle that established his reputation and demonstrated his command philosophy. For Rommel, El Alamein marked the beginning of the end of his military career, though not its conclusion. He would continue to command in Tunisia until March 1943, when poor health forced his return to Germany. In 1944, he would command German forces in France, attempting to repel the D-Day invasion. And in October 1944, implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler, he would be forced to commit suicide to protect his family from Nazi retribution. But Rommel's reputation, built on the victories of 1941 and early 1942, survived his defeat at El Alamein. He remained, in memory, the desert fox, the chivalrous enemy, the brilliant tactical commander, the general who fought cleanly in a dirty war. It was a reputation that obscured some uncomfortable truths about his service to the Nazi regime, but it endured nonetheless. The strategic consequences of El Alamein extended far beyond North Africa. The battle secured the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields for the Allies, ensuring that Britain could maintain its maritime connections to India and the Far East. It prevented the nightmare scenario of an Axis link-up with Japanese forces advancing through Asia. More broadly, El Alamein, combined with the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, which concluded in February 1943, and American victories in the Pacific at Midway and Guadalcanal, marked the point where the Axis powers lost the strategic initiative permanently. After late 1942, Germany, Italy, and Japan would be fighting defensively, responding to Allied offensives, gradually losing ground until final defeat. Military historians have long debated whether Montgomery could have achieved more at El Alamein, whether a more aggressive pursuit might have destroyed the Afrika Korps completely, ending the North African campaign months earlier. Montgomery's critics argue that he was too cautious, too concerned with avoiding casualties, too willing to let Rommel escape. Montgomery himself defended his approach, arguing that a reckless pursuit might have outrun supply lines and exposed British forces to counterattack. Better, he believed, to advance methodically, maintaining supply lines and overwhelming strength, ensuring victory even if it took longer. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that El Alamein was the victory that was needed when it was needed. It might not have been the most elegant or economical victory possible, but it was decisive, it was clear, and it came at a moment. The victory at El Alamein was total. The Afrika Korps was broken, its armor destroyed, and the strategic threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal was over forever. Rommel's legend, and the Axis advance in Africa, was definitively ended. This was a victory of logistics and deception as much as it was courage. It bought the Allies time, secured the Mediterranean, and provided the first true, large-scale success against the Axis powers. Winston Churchill himself summarized the profound change: "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." The momentum of World War II had irrevocably shifted. If you want to understand how superior planning, industrial might, and decisive leadership can combine to turn the tide of a global conflict, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you believe Montgomery's slow, methodical approach was the key to victory, or did the success of Operation Bertram, the deception plan, guarantee the result? Thanks for watching.